All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Wellness Wednesday Inspiration. My name is Fernanda. I'm here with Dr. Linda, and Mark Henick will be joining us today. Today's podcast is super interesting, super relatable to me, and I'm sure to many, many people out there. We're going to be talking about depression. And is depression normal? It sounds like it's becoming a little bit of a common topic nowadays. A lot of people are kind of struggling with depression, anxiety, and just not feeling happy or fulfilled in life. So today is all about talking about depression, and Mark is going to be sharing a little bit about his own experience with it and how he kind of overcame the depression in his own life. So I'm super excited about it. I have my own share of experience with depression as well, which I've kind of shared in different topics in the past, in different podcasts. So I'm excited about kind of hearing how Mark's experience was and just how much he can relate to others and others relate to him. So super excited. Dr. Linda, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Happy Wednesday. And I'm excited about our guests too. How are you? How are you really?
I am a little bit out of it still. I had an
Yeah.
interesting experience this weekend or last weekend. You kind of knew a little bit
Oh,
about it.
yeah. We'll have to
So
chat about that.
yeah, I'm still kind of like out there in space, but
Yeah.
here in form.
Good. Well, I can't wait. We'll have to chat about that. We can always share about that at another podcast,
Of
but
course.
I'm excited to hear about, but I'm really excited about our guest today. So I want to get into this and introduce him. It was, I love just researching, looking up a lot of information like who we're having on our podcast. What are some questions? How is this relevant? Because we want to bring information, that's relevant. It's called Wellness Wednesday Inspiration for that reason, to inspire people to become better versions of themselves, but also, through health and wellness. And Mark is just perfect for this. So a little bit about Mark Henick. He's an internationally recognized mental health strategist and advocate, a speaker. He's an author of the book called So-Called Normal. It's a memoir of family depression and resilience. And what's interesting with Mark, his TED Talk got over 6 million views on it. That is amazing. So that ought to tell you right there that what we're going to talk about today about depression, mental health, what used to be a stigma years ago is something now that we can talk about more in the open and not label it as something, oh, that's for weird people, or it just always has had a bad stigma. And so I'm really excited about he's sharing his experience and just even recent things that he's gone through. But it's really exciting to have him on because when he goes out and as a speaker, I mean, he's talking to all kinds of people from young kids to older, diversity. It doesn't matter, color, bank account, none of that really matters, because I think deep down inside, there's always some sort of commonality when it comes to depression and is it normal and so forth. But, he's accomplished so much already too. He was one of the youngest presidents of Canadian Mental Health Association. So that ought to tell you like a lot right there. And also one of the youngest member of the board of directors for Mental Health Commissions of Canada, and even a spokesperson for the Faces of Mental Illness campaign. So he is really one of those frontline people, just really working with people, connecting with them. And just like you and I in our practices, there's a lot of doctors that have shows and write stuff, but they never see patients, and we're in the mix of things. So, and Mark, the same thing, he has a master's in child development, bachelor of arts, with interdisciplinary honors that focuses on psychology and philosophy. And he also certified in trauma counseling, suicide intervention, mental health. I mean, there's so much that we can go on about that, but I think we should just bring him on because I'm really excited about this topic. And I know it's impacted every single person. Every single person has been impacted by this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Welcome. Thank you for being with us today. I am super excited to be in your presence, Mark, and for you to share your story and share a little bit of your expertise with us, with our audience. and really just talking about a topic that it's become so common nowadays, depression, and everybody just kind of uses the term, I feel like, just so casually now. I'm super depressed, or that's depressing. But what is really depression? Are we really depressed, and what can we do about it? Because ultimately, I feel like the biggest mission in life is to be fulfilled, to be happy, to be joyous, to wake up
Mhm.
and really be thankful and grateful that we're here today. So how can we do that? And I think you would be an amazing person to teach us a little bit of the way. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Fernanda and Dr. Linda. Depression is so many things, and you can show me. I tell people all the time where they're trying to find out, how do you recognize a depressed person? And that's a fair enough question because you want to help, right? But you can also show me 10 different people, all with the exact same diagnosis of major depressive disorder, and they're going to show me 10 different ways to be depressed. So I think we need to really appreciate and celebrate people's individuality and how that extends both to their struggles and to their joys and to the things that work for them. Because ultimately, I think that discovery is what helped my recovery, is realizing that I needed to figure out what worked for me, and that didn't necessarily mean it was going to work for somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you experience depression? What was that? What was living with depression for you? How did you even figure out that you were experiencing depression? Kind of just a little bit about your story.
Sure. Everything really professionally, I think, and for me, started at the point that I thought it was the end. I thought I couldn't possibly go on any further. And it was the second of two stories that I told in the TEDx talk that you mentioned, in which I had climbed up over the railing of a bridge in my hometown, a small town on the east coast of Canada, fully convinced that I needed to die. I use this term, this perceptual collapse, or this cognitive rigidity that had set into me that didn't allow me to see anything outside of that moment. I was entirely hopeless and helpless. And what I think people didn't see or maybe didn't appreciate when I had done the TED Talk that went on to be seen by millions of people was the path, the journey that really had brought me to that place to begin with. And for me, that started, many years earlier. I was first discovered to be suicidal when I was only 12 years old. I was drawing little pictures in the margins, little doodles in the margins of a social studies test that I wasn't prepared for. And the reality was, though, that I think I'd been struggling for a long time, even before that. My grades had started to fall. I had started to struggle in school because I was becoming more depressed. And I feel like nobody really recognized that as a sign at the time, partly because people didn't know what to look for, but also because I think there was just this there was certainly an active stigma against talking about mental health, but even more problematically was this passive stigma that it just wasn't normal. We don't ask people about their feelings or their depression or their mental illness or, heaven forbid, if they might be suicidal, because that's just not the way that we have conversations, right? It hadn't been normalized yet. For me, I think the causes were multifaceted, as they are for many people. I was growing up in a broken home. My parents had split up. We had moved into a new home where I was surrounded via my stepfather by a culture of toxic masculinity, where it just wasn't okay to not be okay. That I was a little boy, but I had to be a man. I had to suck it up, and boys don't cry, and all this stuff. And if we've learned anything from the last 150 years or so of psychology, it's that you can push your emotions away as hard as you want, but that doesn't make them go away. They come out in other ways, and particularly for boys and men in terms of aggressiveness against themselves very often. So that's what I experienced from a young age, from elementary school onward, was this combination of social factors, of mental factors, of psychological factors that didn't allow me to speak about how I was feeling. And then ultimately, I think what didn't catch it early enough and help me early enough was a healthcare system that was just not designed from the very beginning, I think, to help people, especially like me, with complex needs. So, I used to think of myself as a kid who fell through the cracks, but the more I started to work, especially as a clinician, with kids like me who are struggling, is that the system is the cracks. That is the system. Kids are falling through all the time, and we need to do better. So that's why I've dedicated my life ever since high school to helping people to have these conversations and to making systemic change that actually helps people to recover.
Now, that's interesting that you say that, because I have, having 3 children, I mean, 2 are adult now. And I remember in high school, when my son was in high school, and he was on the wrestling team, and then we got news that one of his teammates had suicide himself. And it was just shock. It's like, what? That, everybody liked him, and what would cause him to do that? And there's just so many questions is when something like that does occur. What do you think the commonality is that behind? Is it more like a person's perception of them thinking there's no way out?
I think that it is in many ways. So you mentioned 2, I think, really important points here. One is that people are often very surprised, when a football star or a cheerleader of all people, or a celebrity or somebody who's very popular and seems to have it all, that it turns out they were struggling and that they die by suicide. So one of the most common things I hear is that we didn't see this coming, when in fact we know from the clinical research and otherwise that there's almost always signs that somebody might be contemplating suicide. So again, this comes back to 2 important barriers that we face. One is that we're not trained to look for the signs very often. And the other is that sometimes, especially parents and people who really are very close to people who die by suicide, they just block that out as a possibility. It's too painful to even think about, so they can't even process it. And that's why they miss it, I think. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't see it coming, but it's rarely because the person doesn't show us that it's coming. So there's where we need to do some growth. Why do people get into that place? I think that it's certainly a combination of factors, but we know that mental illness is one of the highest predictors of suicide, depression in particular, and especially substance-related disorders as well are highly correlated with suicide. Mentally, I think that, having been there myself a number of times, you get into a place where you feel like nothing will ever get better, is the first part of it. The second part is that you feel like there's nothing you can do to make it better. So it's a loss of agency that makes you feel trapped, like you're a prisoner. And it's this sense that that the way that things currently are is untenable, that you're not able to manage, that you're not strong enough is the narrative that you think in your head. So, I think that gives us then a clue as to how we can help people, to help give them more agency, and to help show them that the life that they're currently living isn't necessarily going to be the life that they're always going to have. I think if we can introduce that ambivalence, that hope and possibility, that can be really what helps people to get out of that place.
You mentioned something so important and so I think it actually touched me a little bit deeper because of the fact that I think I experienced it for myself, and I've seen it also as a practitioner, as a provider, also even with some of my clients, and that's the fact of denial. Denial of what's going on because of not wanting to get involved or not wanting to experience that pain or even experience that reality. So we kind of just block it out, or we say, oh, it's just a phase, or it's just, it's temporary, or it's not going to apply to him, or it's just, whatever. And we just create a story around it. And that's just not with depression. It applies for many, many other things in life. But depression is a huge one because when we are in denial, when someone is depressed and when nothing's being done, that person it's losing more and more and more hope of, someone coming to the rescue, or someone caring or loving enough to do something for them. And that is so huge. Now, you also talk about the signs, and you mentioned at the beginning that, it can show up in many, many different ways and in many, many different phases or, characteristics. But what would be the major signs that people are experiencing that we may or may not be in denial about?
I look at three primary domains. I mean, people's thoughts, feelings, and their actions. And you're not going to be able to see the symptoms that they're experiencing themselves. You can't see a symptom. That's something that they experience, of course. But you can see signs that perhaps suggest something might be going on. For example, if somebody is withdrawing socially, there's a whole lot of reasons for that. They might have a lack of energy, for example. It's really difficult to get out of bed and to motivate yourself to get on with your day if you have depression. We know that it impacts you physiologically. There could also be a fear. Very, very often people have anxiety along with depression. The rate of comorbidity between those two conditions is very, very high. So that's exactly what I experienced. I had depression, but I had social anxiety disorder as well. So even though I wanted to connect with other people, I was anxious to do so. So it was kind of a double, one of my illnesses was keeping me stuck in the other illness. And we see this all the time as well. So certainly there's the physiological piece. People might be tired. They might be eating either more or less, depending on how they've learned to cope and their relationship is with their own coping. We see all kinds of impacts of physiological stress. Being stressed, and whatever that stressor might be, depression, of course, being a major stressor, is exhausting for our body. It's physically difficult. So you're going to see people getting more colds and flus even. It can compromise their immune system. We certainly see more headaches and gastrointestinal stuff going on. And this is why I said at the very beginning, you can show me 10 different people all with the same diagnosis, and they're going to manifest it in 10 different ways, because it really so much depends on their background. But whatever their specific symptomology is, you're looking for significant changes from their so-called normal. I mean, this is partly why I called the book that, changes from their baseline. Something seems different than they usually are. And this is how we notice it in ourselves too. This is also why I think sometimes people can find it easier to deny that somebody else is changing, because the change is so gradual. It's so slow. It allows us to habituate and get used to it and build up the denial over time, versus somebody who goes through a dramatic change, and then suddenly it's a lot easier to see that they're different. Sometimes you don't realize that somebody has changed until you really take the time to talk to them and to hear them, to get to know them, and to listen with empathy to what they're experiencing.
How would you talk to someone that you suspect? As you said, I mean, it's really difficult to, there's people, it's like, oh, they seem to just like have it all. They have the perfect life and laughing and doing things with friends and aren't picking up any of this, yet suicide occurs. How do you really, can you really talk to them? It's like, really, like, how are you really? Or sometimes just feeling, I always say everyone has some sort of energy, and something's just off with the vibe. Do you find that you become intuitive to that?
I think I do. And I can usually tell when there's something that somebody isn't saying, although I don't think that's a superpower. I think a lot of people can do that if you have, a bit of emotional intelligence and you're paying attention. I also think it's way more common than we're comfortable admitting when you have a gut feeling that something isn't right. And then you don't say anything, either because you think it's going to offend that person or scare them. You think, I don't want to ask them if they're thinking about killing themselves, because what if they weren't, and I give them the idea to do it? That's not a thing. I'm going to tell you that right now, that you're not going to give somebody the idea to go and kill themselves as though they had never thought of it before. That's not how suicide works. This has been researched. One of the most effective ways to prevent suicide is to ask directly. Are you thinking about killing yourself? You don't have to hedge around it. You're probably more nervous about asking than they are about telling. Actually, that's been my experience. But you're not going to give them the idea. One of the major fears that people, or another major fear, I should say, that people experience when they want to ask somebody if they're struggling in that way is, what if they say yes? Then what do I do? I'm not a therapist. I'm not a crisis worker. That's not necessarily what that person needs right at that gateway. You can be a gatekeeper of sorts, or a gate watcher at least, to be able to open that door if they do say that they are indeed a risk of harm to themselves. Then you can be in their corner and help them to connect to services that can help them. You don't have to fix all their problems. Don't promise to keep it a secret. Don't make any commitments that you can't actually fulfill. You're not their therapist. Don't try to cross that boundary. But you can offer to help get them connected with the right professionals who can help them.
Is there like a website, like a nationwide website that people can go to? Because when people are watching this video, they're going to come, it's from some small towns, some big cities. Is there like a national website that someone can go to like, to find someone, or would they go to a counselor? Would they go to a psychologist, a psychiatrist?
Yeah. So there's actually a lot of people don't realize this. There's actually a lot of different routes to recovery, and there's a lot of different doorways depending on what works for you. Now, if you're suicidal or you know somebody who is, there are some very specific resources. If you're located in the US anyway, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is one of the frontline ones that you'll hear. There's crisis lines in many different communities. Certainly talking to your doctor, going to the emergency room. There's mixed advice around calling 911 because particularly in the US, that can go sideways if you're a person of color, for example, or if you're a minority of any kind. There could be some danger associated with that. But you can do it in a more informed way if absolutely necessary. I've found this both as a friend of people who have been suicidal and as a clinician, that generally you don't have to go that route anyway, that it's always better to encourage and to support people to receive voluntary help than it is to ever try to do something the involuntary way. You can't do recovery to people. You can't inject healing into them. That's just not the way these things work. But it might be necessary to help somebody stabilize for a short period of time. So look into crisis lines in your area, local hospitals. It can be helpful if you know that somebody has a history of high-risk behavior or suicidality. If they don't currently have a crisis plan, and you can Google, suicide crisis plan. There's lots of templates out there to help somebody to develop something like that. And what they'll do in there are list, in common versions of it anyway, list resources, people in their life that they know might be able to help them. That could be doctors, it could be teachers, parents, priests, ministers. It could be a wide range of people who are in a position to help or who are qualified to help. And why it's helpful to list those out, especially when the person is well, is because when you enter into a crisis and things start to shut down, your memory works differently. It's a lot harder to bring that stuff to mind when you're in the depth of a crisis. So you prepare for the hard times when you're doing relatively better. And that's where I think friends and family can really help to coach people, to make sure they have those resources at hand for when they need them.
Mark, can you touch a little bit more on going back to your journey? You shared a little bit about your story with depression when you were younger, once you realized that you had it, and how was your story of healing yourself? And once you knew that you were struggling with depression and everything, how did you actually start healing yourself? What kind of things did you do? What kind of resources did you personally tap into, and how has that evolution been basically over the years?
I wish in the acute phase, the acute years of my struggle, that it had ever been that intentional. And if I've learned anything, both in my personal recovery and again as a clinician, is that recovery is messy. In my case, I didn't even know that I was in recovery until many years down the road. So for me, people first found out, it was a teacher actually who first found out that I was suicidal when I was 12. Over the course of the next 12, 13, 14, 4 years, I was in and out of hospital more than half a dozen times with increasingly dangerous suicide attempts, increasingly more intentional suicide attempts. Turns out killing yourself isn't something that you're just born knowing how to do, that it's something that you build a cognitive pathway, that you practice crudely, and you figure it out. And that's why it's such a tragedy when suicides occur, because there are intervention points along the way if the system was better constructed to help people. But that aside, coming in and out of hospital, trying cocktails of different medications. I didn't have the benefit of receiving a whole lot of psychotherapy when I was going through this acute phase of my struggle, because we didn't have a lot of psychotherapists available to us. I was in for two rounds of CBT, I guess. One was 6 weeks, one was 6 to 8 weeks, I think. And those periods in my struggle were actually helpful. They were relative improvements while I was receiving that kind of support. But then when those supports went away, so too did my recovery. You know, when you pull away the scaffolding that is helping to support people before they're ready to do it on their own, then nothing changes. If nothing changes, you know, you go back to the same state that you were in before. So for me, the moment of change that I traced it back to anyway, came in that suicide attempt that I talk about in my TED talk, where I climbed up over the railing of that bridge. I'd been in and out of hospital so many times, I came to be known as a frequent flyer of the mental health care system. And I felt like it was just completely hopeless, that I had talked to so many doctors already and they couldn't help me. So maybe it meant that I was unhelpable. Maybe I was just one of the unlucky few who had a broken brain, and it would never get any better. This is that toxic mix of hopelessness and helplessness that gets people stuck in that place. So I had climbed up over that railing and I was ready to die. And if it wasn't for a complete stranger who stopped and talked to me, then I wouldn't be here today. He stopped and he introduced himself. He talked to me. I wasn't talking a whole lot back to him, but he left space. He left the silence and he didn't leave. And as he talked to me, I felt my perception kind of loosen up a little bit, or become a bit more expansive, and I became a bit more aware, less collapsed, more aware of my surroundings. And then I had noticed that the police had arrived and they had barricaded the bridge. Crowds had gathered to watch. I didn't hear any of these people arrive originally because I was so dissociated in the moment. And then there was another man on the sidelines who shouted out for me to jump, and he called me a coward. And when I had that experience of these two complete strangers, one on the sidelines, one who literally was, had my back, who was there talking to me. When the guy on the sidelines told me to jump and called me a coward, I let go of the railing and I started to fall. And that was when the stranger, who I could only see was wearing a light brown jacket, who was standing behind me, he grabbed me and he pulled me back over the railing. I was sent back to hospital, and, I didn't suddenly receive the medication that changed everything or the therapy that changed everything for me. But something changed, I think, inside me. And it took me more than a dozen years, 12, 13 years, to realize very slowly that it was the image of these two strangers that night, who were watching the exact same situation unfold in front of them, but each made a very different choice. They each made a very different choice in how they reacted to what they saw in front of them. One guy chose to stand on the sidelines and to push me over with his words and with his uncaring and disempathy. And the other guy chose the opposite, to have my back and to reach out and literally grab me and save my life. And I think that was when unconsciously I made a decision to be like that stranger who saved my life. I wanted to have other people's backs and to reach out and to save other people. And the way that I started to do that was with my story, was sharing my story openly. And, over the decade, it became a positive feedback loop where I got better and better, I think, every time I shared my story. And every time I relapsed, I got a little bit better. It got a little bit less worse each time. So, many years later, I was able to finally find that stranger who saved my life and thank him for everything that he had given me.
That's so powerful what you said. As that just, I think, comes to perception with two different people looking at the situation differently, of one more out of love and one more out of maybe anger. I don't know, the fellow who grabbed your jacket was, I think, doing it more out of love. How do you still struggle with depression?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think for a very long time, the answer was yes. One of the reasons why I didn't realize that I was in recovery, why I didn't realize that bridge attempt was the last time I ever tried to kill myself. You'd think that'd be the type of thing that you would remember. But for me, I didn't even realize, because I thought I was still struggling so badly for so many years. I would relapse at first twice a year, and then once a year, and then once every 2 years. And now I don't identify as having depression anymore, which is strange for me, because I had major depressive disorder for more of my life than I hadn't. I had it for more than half my life. And now I look at my life and think, I don't meet any of the clinical symptoms anymore. I don't meet the guidelines for having depression. So can you have an illness if you don't really meet the threshold anymore? And there are some people who will say, yes, this is a chronic condition, you'll have it for the rest of your life, there is no cure. I actually don't subscribe to that view. If you don't meet any of the criteria anymore, then maybe you don't have it anymore. And maybe I'll get it again. Who knows? I've been lucky enough before. But as it stands right now, I don't have depression, and I live every day in gratitude for that fact, that I was able to get through 100% of the worst moments of my life.
That's an interesting point you made, because the way that, in my opinion, at least, the way that we see ourselves, the way that we identify ourselves, it's how we project out into the world. So if you look at yourself in the mirror and you see someone who is ugly, you see someone who's dumb, you see someone who's overweight, you see someone who's depressed, you see someone who is incapable, etc., that's how you project yourself into the world. And therefore, those are the results that you get back into your life. And in the other way is if you see yourself as beautiful and powerful and smart and intelligent and happy and joyous, but subconsciously you really see yourself as that and you truly believe it, that's how you project yourself out into the world, and that's what the universe gives you back as well. So when you said just a couple of minutes ago, I don't identify myself as a depressed person anymore, even if anybody else could say, well, you still meet the criteria, or even if you don't meet the criteria, it doesn't go away. Those are their opinions, and that's all that is to it, right? And because of other people's opinions doesn't mean that it applies for you.
No, I think that's true. And actually, I think that that's one of the enduring stigmas as well, is that when we reduce these experiences down to simply the broken brain theory, it actually embeds stigma further. It makes it harder for people to change when we tell them that they are not like you and I. That they're just, and we tried that. We tried putting people away because they're different or they're mentally inferior or weaker or all these other, things that we don't believe anymore. And it didn't work. When in reality, I think if you actually look at the neuroscience, if you look at the psychology behind the vast majority of mental illnesses, now I will not paint too broad of a brush here. There are some that are more neurological than others. If you look at schizophrenia, for example, or bipolar disorder to an extent, ADHD, there are experiences that are differently neurological than things like depression or anxiety. That doesn't necessarily make them worse. You can have a pretty high functioning version of schizophrenia, for example, and have a much higher state of your well-being than someone with severe depression. This isn't the struggle Olympics either, right? We're not comparing diagnoses, but the point is that when we say mental illness in the singular, there are hundreds of different types of mental illnesses, first of all, but then gradations of each of those illnesses are highly different, highly variable between individuals as well. So I think that it's one of my pet peeves when I hear people say mental illness in the singular, that person has mental illness. That means absolutely nothing to me. That's like saying this person who has a cold and this one who has cancer and this one has diabetes, they have physical illness. You're going to have to get a little more specific. And I think that we need to move to the next step of mental health awareness, where we become a little bit more sophisticated in our understanding of mental illness. It's not just that there's all these other people over here with the broken brains and we have to fix those poor people. That doesn't work. And it's not actually reflective of the science.
And I think a lot of it has to do, you mentioned, as I was looking at some of your videos and reading about you, I think a lot has to do with perspective. So you're different today. I mean, you're married, you have children, you have a wife now, compared to where you were when you were that teenager in high school who really just thought about it a lot. Now, since COVID hit last year, I mean, the crisis hotline, some of the counselors that I've spoken to that are colleagues of mine, they are just so busy right now. They're like, and that's like the busiest time ever they've been with, people calling, they're fearful. You had something, you're the sole provider for your family. You had something happen in your, with you and your, with business and financial income and all that, which would be pretty stressful for a lot of people. I don't know if you want to share about that and how did you deal with that? Because that's like, whoa, a lot of people could, I think, relate, but their only way out would be, I don't know, something maybe not so positive.
You know, it's funny. My relationship with struggle now and with change is much different than than certainly it was when I was a teenager. Um, I'm of the firm belief that a lot of our suffering comes from our clinging to trying to keep things together, to keep things the way we think things are supposed to be. It's a resistance, a rigidity that comes. So when COVID hit, you know, I had back in 2017, actually, I had decided to leave the 9 to 5 normal career. And I got a book deal, so I was going to go off and write my book and build my business, which I'd been doing kind of on the side for many years anyway, and successfully so. But I finally took the plunge once I had got the book deal in hand to go off and do it full time. That meant letting go of the security and the safety of having a so-called normal job,
Mhm.
and instead going off and being an entrepreneur, something that I had no experience, or I thought I had no experience with before. So that's what I did, and was successfully building my business for several years until, of course, like so many other people, in March of 2020, the pandemic hit and everything fell apart. You know, when you get into consulting and become an entrepreneur and any kind of private practice type thing, you work contracts, you build out contracts, and I had many built out for more than a year, both, you know, speaking and workshops and a variety of consulting contracts. All of them, however, have clauses in them that let the contractor cancel or rebook, at least, if there's a so-called act of God or a force majeure. Uh, there's no bigger unexpected kind of circumstance than a global pandemic.
Yeah.
So over the course of 3 days, all of my future work canceled their contracts or had to rebook to an
Oh.
indefinite time. So suddenly I found myself having a year's worth of my finances planned out, and having among my best years ever, to suddenly having nothing. Everything that I had in my savings was all that I had, and I had a family to support. That was one of the scarier experiences of my life, as you might imagine, not knowing
Mm.
how I was going to pay my rent or feed my family. But, you know, something I think I'm a firm believer that everything that has happened to you in your life so far is preparing you for this moment. I mean, there is no other
Mhm.
option, right? You are the sum total of everything you've ever been. So I had learned to be resilient, to have this grit inside me that when faced with seemingly hopeless circumstances, I just bear down and get done what needs to be gotten done. So over the course of several days, I decided, rather impulsively, I think, to open up about my experiences. I opened up on Twitter, and it goes viral all over the place. And suddenly, you know, people are saying that they were experiencing the exact same thing. And then I was invited to write a piece for CNBC, which ended up becoming their #1 trending article on across the CNBC network for a whole day, I think it was at the time, because a whole country, not just one country, almost all countries were dealing with
Mm.
what I was dealing with. So this is exactly what happened when I was suicidal and finally opened up about it. Uh, Feeling so incredibly, crushingly lonely, I didn't see that so many other people were going through
Mm.
the same thing. That it's like there's this whole community of people who are feeling alone together and they don't realize it because they're not talking about it to each other. So when I did that, I suddenly realized that there were so many people who were going through just what I was. And opening up was really what gave me the strength then to pivot my business, to flex, to find other options and figure it out. And surely enough, you know, I was able to figure out, partly through, like so many times in my life, partly through hard work and being able to think of new ways to do business, but also thankfully through the intervention of a stranger. A complete stranger offered us money to help us get through a couple of months to get back on our feet, to cover our basic living expenses for us. And I wasn't one to take that opportunity lightly. So I entirely turned my business around, and it actually ended up being one of the most successful years that we've ever had. And it was thanks to that moment of crisis and the generosity of that stranger. So I think that there's a lesson there for all of us, that you are more resilient than you think you are, that we doubt ourselves, but when it really comes down to it, trust your instincts, work hard, and reach out, open up, and you'd be surprised what can happen.
Mhm.
Right. And it's also, I think, important to realize that when we are in a place where we feel like we're hitting rock bottom, whether financially, in a relationship, emotionally, physically, whatever aspect, really the only way at that point is up. Right, there is no going down anymore, right? So you can learn everything, you can take everything that you learn, you can take everything that you have at that moment and just build yourself up, and the resilience, right? You are resilient. But when you are at those moments, a lot of people kind of tend to kind of start getting into that mental state of why me, why does it have to be me, why did it happen to me? But just understanding that it's, in a sense, the universe kind of sending you a signal. Hey, it's time to pivot. Hey, it's time to get out of the relationship. It's time to shift gears and do things in a different way. It's kind of like what I see it, like visualize it, like the universe kind of just slapping you and telling you get up and get moving in a different way. It's time to take action in a different way.
This is just it. When we're so rigidly clinging again to that structure of the life that we thought we'd have or how we thought things were supposed to go, that's what causes the suffering. Now when I encounter struggle, it's not that I don't have difficulty with it. Of course I have difficulty, but it's like, okay, I was raised Irish Catholic. Life is hard. That's what you learn from a very young age. Life is hard. What are you going to do? And so that's kind of how I approach almost every struggle. It's like, well, that sucked. I don't know why that happened. What are we going to do now?
Right.
What else? You have to validate the struggle for sure. You can't just ignore that the tragedy or the crisis happened. Validate it, but then you got to move on too. It's like, well, what are we going to do now? How are we going to use this? And that's, in my writing, the writer Anne Lamott has famously said that you own everything that happened to you. And David Sedaris, the writer, has said something very similar, right? That everything that happens to you is material. It's creative juice to do something with.
Mhm.
So why not use it? And, that's what I've done. And I think that's been a primary way that I've built my career, has been using that rawness, that stuff of life, and doing something good with it instead of just letting it sit on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what I see with you, Mark? I see flexibility. It's like the tree in the storm. When the storm hits the tree, it's either it's going to bend and weather the storm, or it's just not going to bend and it's going to be ripped out. And I think I would bend and get a little bit beat up and being completely ripped out. So I see you more of that person that, like you said, it's like, okay, you're going to get through this somehow. And just being a person of flexibility and perspective has really, I think, allowed you to share your story, and something that maybe as often people would think of, oh, that was something that happened bad in my life. Actually, it worked for good in your life, because you are impacting literally millions of people with something that could have been so horrific, yet something that came out so beautifully. That how many people's lives have you saved? Who knows? Not just your own, but many more. So I just wanted to acknowledge you and thank you for sharing with our audience. And of course, so many people are going to be seeing this this conversation that we're having, and we really appreciate it, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And that really does mean a lot, because at the end of the day, it's not like I set out with some grand plan of how to change mental health for people or the world. I'm just doing the only thing that I know how to do. And hopefully it helps some people along the way. But I do this because this is just what I do. And maybe someday I'll do something different. I can't imagine, because this is all I know how to do is talk about mental health. But, it's a really beautiful place to get to in your life. And I hope everybody has this opportunity to be able to build their passion, to be able to create who they are, and not just stand back and wait to find out who they are. You make yourself. You get to decide. You are the author and the editor of your whole life.
Yes.
Mark, as we come to the end of the podcast, I want to ask you for maybe 2 or 3 takeaways that you can give to the audience that may be feeling like they're falling apart, there is no way out, that they're struggling with the way that they're feeling, they're not able to maybe see the way out at the moment. What would you tell those people?
sometimes, and this isn't going to sound very inspiring, but I'm going somewhere with it. Sometimes life just sucks. Sometimes it's really hard. And I say that because there's nothing worse than that toxic positivity, right? Than that silver lining, everything telling you, oh, everything will get better. Right. But that's not how it feels right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes it's just really hard, and that's okay. It's allowed to be hard. Don't set up these expectation for your life that it's good vibes only. Everything's going to be great and I'm going to be awesome. No, sometimes you just got to grind through it. And I wish somebody had taught that to me when my life, at the moments when my life was the hardest and I didn't know that. So it's going to be hard sometimes. That's okay. That's actually what builds resilience. You don't build resilience by just laying down and taking it. You build resilience by going through the struggle. So that's the first thing, is that things are going to be hard, but you're stronger than you think. The other thing that I would suggest to you is not to believe everything that you think and feel, that your thoughts and feelings are data points. Sometimes, I don't know if anybody's ever told you this before, but sometimes you're wrong. And that's okay to be wrong. And it's great to be wrong. You know, when I went away to college, I went to a liberal arts school. And the idea behind the liberal arts is that you challenge everything, that you question everything, you become a skeptic. That's not to say that you don't trust your intuition and all that stuff, but sometimes you can be misguided. So take your thoughts and feelings as data points. Take it as information along the way, but don't take yourself too seriously. I think you need to recognize that maybe you don't have all the information in any given situation. If you think that something is helpless and hopeless, you might in fact be wrong. And that can help you to open up to other possibilities and other options that are out there for you. So please practice that. Practice being wrong more. And I promise you, it will expand your mind and it will open you up to a whole world that maybe you didn't even realize was there.
I love that. Life sucks sometimes. I was just writing notes on this. I'm like,
I think
that's
going to be on my tombstone or my obituary. Life sucks sometimes. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the reality, right? And it's going to be hard. But you know what? I found this so many times. What's better than going through something hard with other people that know that it's hard? Then you have a team. Then you have a tribe.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Mark, where can people find you?
I'm on most social media platforms, though I haven't been going on Twitter as much lately, just because it isn't my thing lately. But I'm on most social platforms at Mark Henick, at MarkHenick. My website is markhenick.com, and the book is So-Called Normal, a memoir of family, depression, and resilience. That's available on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, Indigo in Canada, most other major and minor bookstores worldwide.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was such an amazing experience to listen to your story and really learn from you. And I love the 2 takeaway points. Absolutely love those takeaway points.
Yeah.
I'm just very grateful that you're here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yes, we really just, I was like taking notes here. I'm like, okay, I got to make sure I get this down, because we all experience it, and I know I have as well. So thank you so much once again, and we will see everyone next week. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.